Uh, okay. Welcome everybody. This is Michael Mikowski. I'm the president of JINSA. We're very honored to have Ambassador Elliott Abrams today. As I said, for the second time this week, we're fortunate to have him today. And let me, he's has a number of hats. He is a senior fellow with the Council of Foreign Relations. He's the chair of TICFA. He's the chair of the Vandenberg Coalition. He's also the a former. He's held a number of senior posts in the U.S. government, in the Trump administration. He's special envoy for Venezuela for Iran in the Bush administration. He was. I'm sorry.
Trump administration.
I'm sorry, the Trump administration. I apologize. Trump administration. He was special envoy for Venezuela, Iran in the Bush administration. He was deputy national security advisor, and then he was an assistant secretary of state even a long time ago in the Reagan administration. And we're going to talk about this book right here, which maybe it looks backwards when I show it on the camera. I don't know, but If You Will It, and it just came out. And we want to have a conversation with Elliott about that. And Elliott, welcome, and thanks for joining us again.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right, so let me ask you, at least for our audience, probably, as opposed to maybe some of the other audience, like you might have, we usually participate with us. You're part of our Iran task force. We did that task force together the day after on Gaza. Obviously, you're one of the leading national security experts in Washington, respected on both sides of the aisle. But as this book shows, and of those people who know you personally, you have a real commitment to the Jewish people, period. And this book is, while it says, if you will it, the subheading is Rebuilding Jewish Peoplehood for the 21st Century. So let me just ask you, just to start off broadly, I always find it interesting to ask others, what led you to write this book? And then we'll get into what the book is about. So.
I wrote a book about the American Jewish community in 1997 called Faith or Fear. It was a reaction to the numbers that were coming out in the 90s about the American Jewish community. Just to give you one example, a number that made people incredulous and fearful. The intermarriage rate was 52%, the highest it had ever been. Fast forward 25 years, there have been a number of new studies of the American Jewish community, including the largest one, the Pew Research Center study, Jewish Americans in 2020. And they said the condition of the American Jewish community is in many ways very good, growing. When I looked at the numbers, I thought, that's wrong. It's not in great shape. It's not growing. So I went back to look at my 1997 book and see, what did I say there? And what did I recommend? How did it work out? And I wanted to take another look now and make an argument to people who care about this, most of whom will be Jews, but not all, that the condition of the American Jewish community is not good in terms of passing on this sense of being a member of this people, of this community, to generations that are coming. And I wanted to say, what do we do about it? If you care about it, what can be done?
So, and you list, if you don't mind, and the beginning of the book, you really mine this Pew Research survey from 2020. I wonder if you could just articulate some of the findings, including on an intermarriage, which obviously is an important theme.
Well, let me give you just a few. The intermarriage rate, again, 1990 was 52%. It was shocking.
Yeah.
It's now well over 70% for non-Orthodox Jews. Orthodox Jews are about 10% of the community. For non-Orthodox Jews, over 70%. Let me give you a couple more. For people raised by two Jewish parents or one Jewish parent, one or two, a third of those people no longer identify as Jewish. So a third have just moved out of the Jewish community. Here's another one. There's 2.4 million children living today in households with one Jewish parent or two Jewish parents, at least one. Half of them are being raised exclusively as Jews. Half of them are not. They're being raised as nothing, or as Christians and Jews, or as Christians again. Loss. How many Jews who say their religion is Judaism, who say they're Jews by religion, how many of them say it's very important to them that their grandchildren be Jewish? 45%. The majority do not say it's very important to them. And I give you one more number. You know, we've had birthright programs sending young American Jews to Israel for 20 years. They've sent hundreds of thousands to Israel, including all those people. Fewer than half of American Jews, 45%, have ever visited Israel once. So all of those, you know, are figures that suggest, let's just say, they don't suggest vitality and growth.
Hey, so you talk about this. This intrigued me also, and maybe you could speak autobiographically about it. When you were talking about the intermarriage, you said how Jews used to live near each other.
Yeah.
And I think you say something like when you were younger, maybe except for maybe the plumber or something, everyone, or maybe the plumber, I can't remember, but everyone who came to your house was a Jew almost. Sorry if you could.
I will tell the story.
Yeah.
When you know, in the years of great Jewish immigration here, which is 1880 to about to World War I, that's when millions of Jews came, and they lived together in Jewish neighborhoods, partly because they wanted to, partly because they were poor, partly because of anti-Semitism and exclusion. And that continues right up until after World War II, when Jews begin to move to the suburbs. So that now Jews, non-Orthodox Jews, Orthodox Jews need to live near a synagogue so they can walk there on the Sabbath. So those are pretty dense Jewish communities. For everybody else, 90% of the community, it's dispersion. Well, I grew up in New York City in Queens, and we lived in a neighborhood that was about 1/3 Catholic, 1/3 Lutheran, 1/3 Jewish. But it was socially segregated. There was a Jewish Boy Scout troop, there was a Christian Boy Scout troop. There were Cub Scout troops, were all different. I remember it would have been 1959 when my father sold our car in the way that you often used to in those days. You put an ad in the New York Times, someone calls you up. They made an agreement and they came to our house, you know, to give the certified check, get the title, drive away with the car. So, you know, they rang the bell, they came in, we sat in the living room, this was all done. Why do I remember this? It was the only time I remember growing up that Christians were in our house on a kind of social basis, not as workers, not as the plumber, not as the TV repairman, not as the electrician. There was real social segregation. Again, part of it was anti-Semitism, part of it was voluntary on the part of Jews. But what's changed now is that if you want to raise your children with a sense of community and peoplehood, it's not going to be automatic. It needs to be intentional. You've got to do something to create that community, that sense of peoplehood.
I think you also referenced, correct me if I'm wrong, about like Jewish summer camps, which there still are.
Well, I think there's three things. It used to be, I mean, you grew up as a Jewish kid and, you know, pick a year, 1930, 1940. That was an immersive Jewish experience. Most American Jews don't have that. So how do you create it? Three things. One, Jewish education, Jewish schooling. Two, and people think this is kind of trivial, nice, but not important, but it is important, Jewish summer camping. Why is it important? Because for many young American Jews, it's the only time for this total immersion, for living as a Jew among other Jews, to create that sense of identity, that sense of this is who I am. And the third thing is time in Israel. We know that birthright has had an impact, not on everyone who goes, but on many of the people who go. And that's 10 days, or I sometimes put it, 10 lousy days. And it can have a life-changing impact. So think of a month in Israel, a summer in Israel, a gap year in Israel, a semester or junior year abroad in Israel. That is going to have obviously a much deeper impact on a greater percentage than 10 days. So those three things, education, summer camping, time in Israel, and more is better.
Where does synagogues fit in on those, you think?
Very interesting question, because I've had a number of rabbis, who read the book and said, I like what you said, but synagogues are missing. I'm missing. And there are people who've written about this. I think, for example, of Jack Wertheimer, a professor at Jewish Theological Seminary, and his three are education, summer camping, synagogue. And I guess my rejoinder, my argument would be, if you're in you can't reach everybody through the synagogue. There are significant portion of the community that isn't in a synagogue, or they may be in a synagogue until the child needs to be bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, and then they leave the synagogue. So you need to think of other ways than the synagogue. I don't deny the importance, but I don't think it reaches the numbers that we need.
By the way, if I could just ask you on this a little more on I completely agree with you. I hadn't thought of summer camps at all, honestly, maybe because I didn't go to one, but I always thought Jewish day school is critical, especially in the early years before bar mitzvah. But I'm just curious how you see how things have in America on that score. Is it growing, the Jewish day school? Or
It is. For non-Orthodox Jews, well, let me start again. For Orthodox Jews, demand for day schools is essentially inelastic. That is, your kids really have to go. For non-Orthodox Jews, demand is quite elastic, and it depends on things like where you live, where's the nearest school, money. How much is it? Can you afford it? For non-Orthodox Jews, there's been a model for, let's say, back to World War II, 75 years, which is Hebrew school, meaning after school programs in the synagogue. So each synagogue has its own, and it prepares you in a way for bar or bat mitzvah. It's failed. First, many of them are just no good. That shouldn't be shocking. Why should we believe that every synagogue is going to be able to hire great teachers? And it isn't enough time. The kids, they have school during the day, and they have, violin lesson, little league, soccer. It isn't enough time. If you look at the other diaspora communities, Australia, Canada, Britain, France, a greater percentage of kids goes to a Jewish school at some point. As you said, it may be elementary school, it may not be K-12, but the difference is money. In all those countries, the government helps. It gives you a tax deduction, or it may give a per pupil subsidy to the school. It helps defray the cost, and more kids go. So I think we need to do a lot more experimentation with alternatives to the old failed, I would say, Hebrew school model. Day schools are one answer, although it's very expensive. There are other answers. There are communities, Houston is just an example, where a number of synagogues have gotten together to do post bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah activities. Houston has a Jewish community of maybe 50,000, I think. It's a social occasion for the kids that gets beyond their own synagogue. It's an intellectual occasion. And the idea is to sort of break that synagogue model and improve the quality of the teaching as well. That's just one example. There are many others. But I think what we can say is the old model just is not working.
Yeah. I saw that when I was a kid. I went to Sunday school because my dad was the principal, but you could see a big difference in kids who go to Hebrew school and kids who go to full-time Jewish day school.
But and by the third category, kids who get no Jewish education whatsoever.
Sure. By the way, if I may ask, I don't know, I don't think you raised in the book. If you did, then I apologize. But one thing that intrigues me is having a young child is non-Orthodox Jewish day schools. A lot of them are progressive that I see, and I don't know why that's the case exactly.
Well,
Yeah,
yeah, this is very interesting. I would even go further and say that there are Orthodox day schools
yeah,
that have been unwilling to fight the woke virus. There, and of course, it's probably worse in, let's say, community schools, non-Orthodox day schools. Yeah, it's, I think, Jews as a community are highly educated in secular terms. And, therefore, are aware of the kind of woke stuff that's going around. But I know of for example, a Jewish day school that has a transgender teacher for kindergarten or first grade, which certainly, according to halakha, Jewish law, is a very odd thing to be doing. As you said, I chair Tikva, which is a Jewish educational NGO. We opened the school in Manhattan. We call it, we don't call it a Jewish day school. We call it a Jewish prep school because it is not strictly Orthodox. That is, the boys and girls learn together, for example. They're not separated. The food is kosher. There's a religious service every morning, but it isn't strictly Orthodox. And I think what we're finding is that, at least in New York, I think this is true elsewhere too, parents who are paying attention to what education their kids are getting, particularly in the most prestigious prep schools, are finding out it's not only is it woke in general, they're being taught anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli things. And many of the parents, they just can't put up with it anymore.
I was saying in the Washington area, one thing that struck me as my kid and my daughter is 7 now. A couple of years ago, one prominent Jewish day school, there aren't that many in the Washington area. First thing they said to us on the phone was, just want you to know we're for diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's a Jewish day school. I don't even know what that means. I guess I'm ignorant of this stuff, but I didn't know what it means in the Jewish context. And that was the first thing they said to us. I said, well, thank you very much. And that was surprising to me. All right. Well, look, I could by the way, I did read that about Tick, and I also think I saw, correct me, I think it'd be interesting. I was thinking, God, I wish that would come to Washington because that's where I live. But it seems like there's been a tremendous interest in getting into the school. I mean, if you don't mind,
Tikva, we call the school is called Emmet, Emmet Classical Academy. What's the classical bit? There are in America a few hundred Catholic classical schools and Protestant evangelical classical schools. This is the first classical Jewish school. And what I mean by that is, what do we teach? We teach Hebrew and Latin. And we're trying to teach kids that they are the heirs, as Americans. They are the heirs to two great traditions. As Jews, to the Jewish tradition, going back to the Bible. And as Americans, to the Western tradition of Greece and Rome. And parents seem to think it's a good idea. We think it's a very good idea. We've had parents around the country, as you're saying, from various cities saying to us, why can't we do that here? Yeah. The answer we give is frankly the one that you get in some of these Catholic or Protestant networks of schools, which is do it. We can help you with the curriculum, which we've mapped out. We've got it. We can help you search for teachers. But the effort to raise some money, find space, which is important, recruit students. We can't do that from Tikva in New York. That's something that has to be done community by community. There is a kindergarten in Austin, Texas, based on this, actually teaching Hebrew. There are efforts in some other places, and I think this idea is going to grow. And I think it's important partly because there are parents who would be open to sending their kids to a Jewish school, but they may not be Orthodox and may not be that enthusiastic about a, let's say, purely Orthodox school. So it's an experiment. We only started it now, this fall, September. And, it'll grow next year, and we believe keep on growing.
That's wish you luck, because both my parents worked in Jewish education. It seems to me have a Jewish day school education to me is critical, and it's a good segue. I ask because I want to jump ahead to about the Jewish community. Then when I get about the U.S.-Israel relationship, as you discuss at length here, and obviously is a focus at JINSA, but we are the Jewish Institute for National Security of America. It's interesting because you talk about more in the middle of the book or later about how the American Jewish community, even though they lived near each other, or they were new, a lot of them were new because, as you point out, I think something like 2 million Jews came from 1880 to what, 1920?
1924, when the standards
closed.
tightened up a lot. Yeah, the immigration law changed.
Now, on the other hand, as you make clear, there wasn't much Jewish support for Zionism. Of course, Zionism, I think for those of us, and or probably most people watching, or even we think it's a relatively new historical movement. Herzl's Basel Conference was in 1897. A lot of Jews were very ambivalent about it. You make it clear that a lot of American Jews didn't really focus so much on Zionism, looked at Jews living in Palestine as a charity, even in later years. And that you point out, you mentioned Brandeis and how important he is, but you also make clear, and I think it's important, it's a really important historical perspective because it's hard to remember it, for people to know this or remember it, is the American Jewish community wasn't very influential in the early years of the state of Israel. I mean, they had you mentioned how they had almost no engagement with Eisenhower, and just sticking to the American Jewish community before we get to that.
We've tended to read back the last 10, 25 years and into history and say, this is what we're familiar with, and presumably it was always like this. It's not true. If you go back to, let's go after World War I. The leadership of the American Jewish community was mostly rich German Jews. And they were, integrated in America. And their view of Zionism was that it was dangerous, that it would lead to dual loyalty charges. American Jews were in the promised land. America was the greatest place. People should not be thinking about some kind of Jewish state someplace. They were not indifferent, they were opposed. At the top. The Jewish masses, poor Jews, working class Jews, were for it, but it wasn't a passionate movement, at least until the Nazi period. And it became increasingly obvious to American Jews that a refuge was needed, a refuge of some sort. So you see growth in support for Zionism. And you see that particularly in the period 45 to 48. Should there be a Jewish state? Yes. American Jews were in favor. Again, not all the leadership. The leadership of the American Jewish Committee, for example, was very sensitive about this idea that Ben-Gurion might try to tell American Jews, you should all move to Israel. That's what Zionism means. And they actually forced him to sign an exchange of letters in which he said, I would never ask an American Jew to move to Israel, which obviously was, tugged out of him. But what's striking to me is you do get this increase in Zionist feeling, and then you have 48. And the Jewish state is formed, and the Zionist activity and passion in the US starts to decline and decline and decline. Because in the post-war period, American Jews were mostly concerned with being Americans, with living in this country more successfully, with getting out of, urban ghettos and building careers and getting to those top 100 colleges. Then there was a big increase in 1967. But again, it dissipates. If you look at, for example, I don't know how you measure it, Israel bond donations in 1967, way up. But then look at 68, 69, 70, 71. So it goes down again, which is one of the reasons that I wonder when people say, October 7th and its aftermath will change the American Jewish community forever. Maybe, but 1948 didn't. The Holocaust didn't. The 56 war, the 67 war, the 73 war, yeah, they had an impact, and slowly but surely the impact disappeared. Now, maybe this is different because of anti-Semitism, but maybe. My prediction would be that it isn't a permanent change. I should just take a minute on anti-Semitism and say that, because we don't know what the level is going to be 1, 2, 3 years from now in the US. But the first studies that I've seen of American colleges that looked at the impact on American college kids find that the ones who go in, who went to college with what, this is Professor Eitan Hirsch at Tufts who did the study, the ones who went in with what he calls a high Jewish background. Were you bar mitzvah? Does your family belong to a synagogue? Have you ever been to Israel? They became Jewish activists. The Hamas rallies, the anti-Semitism motivated them. For the students who came to campus with what he called low Jewish background, the family never belonged to a synagogue, never bar mitzvah, never went to Israel, never this, never that. They weren't motivated by what they saw on campus. They just kind of stood back. It's logical in a way. So returns are not in. Come back in 5 years and let's see.
I look forward to that. Let me ask you though about 1948 or 47, yep. 48 about the American Jewish community, and then we'll turn into the bilateral issue. But look, I'll just say this. I mean, it's not a script. So JINSA's vice chairman, Joel Gamunder, he was about 7 or 8 years old. He heard, I think he heard a rabbi or someone say, you could buy a bullet for 5 cents. So give for every 5 cents you give to Israel or you gave to a certain fund, it allows the Haganah or IDF, whatever, to buy another bullet. He rode the subways of New York City as a little kid, and he raised something like $4,500. Which is something like, I don't know, I looked it up. I don't know, is that $65,000 just for a little kid? And and we're obviously he gives us more than that now, and but he might have.
What the question would be?
Yeah.
Could he have done it in 1950? In 48, at the time the state is formed and there's a war. I mean, Arab countries are trying to destroy Israel. They're in the middle of a war. You can do that. 2 years later, if you go to the Jews, it seems like it's okay. It seems like it's settled down. And you can see it in poll data, and you can see it in things like Israel bonds.
Well, I was just curious in 48 because I really know did the American Jewish community, as you point out, they didn't really have much engagement. They had some, but not much. I think Truman, with the presidents at the time, but were they doing things to support at least Israel as they were fighting for their very existence in the War of Independence, or was that? I mean, the story of my vice chairman more the exception, I assume, but I don't know.
Well, again, there were other exceptions. There were individuals, who went over to fight.
Yeah.
Um, Jews did not have the influence, I mean, that we have today. There was, there's no AIPAC. If you look back at influential members of Congress, New York Congressman Emanuel Seller, chairman of the Judiciary Committee in the House for decades. What was his impact on Roosevelt or on Truman? You don't see much. And while it is true, for example, that Truman recognized the state of Israel 11 minutes after it declared independence, he then imposed an arms embargo. So during this war of independence, while they're being attacked by Arab states, the United States is refusing that one bullet that Gumunder raised the money for. He had to do it because the United States government was not doing it. And this goes on essentially until John Kennedy. So that's 14 years after the foundation of the state. We agree to sell them a defensive missile, air defense missiles. The real arms relationship comes after 67 under Lyndon Johnson. So that's 20 years later.
Okay, so it's a good segue. So let's talk about that because yeah, I think it would surprise Americans what you said. I think you said the first, well, you would know better than me, so I'm not going to go look it up, but I think it was the first, there was some a loan, and then there was some economic assistance, but that was for absorbing immigrants from Europe, from not, right, in the 50s. And then the first economic, I mean, the first aid, which was still minimal, was under Kennedy, right? Is that what you're talking about now?
Right? It really, the relationship that we all know really starts after the 67 war, when the kind of national security establishment and the president, Johnson then, come to the realization that Israel's not an albatross. It's an ally. It's an asset of the United States. And they see the Arabs on the other side, many of them turning to the Russians. Now, the argument had been in the State Department and in CIA, everything we do for Israel is a mistake because it's going to turn the Arabs against us. After 67, you begin to see the counter argument again, first in the Johnson administration, then to some extent under Nixon as well, that Israel can be an important asset to the United States. And you begin to see the aid levels rise and the military relationship really begins to grow. And you have, of course, in the 73 war, the great shipments during the war, the Nixon administration sends a lot of armaments to Israel and backs the Soviet Union off by going to DEFCON 3, to say, don't try anything.
By the way, I'll just add Ron Dermer, of course, well, but just to remind the audience, so he now Minister of Strategic Affairs, Israeli ambassador for 7.5 years, and was JINSA Distinguished Fellow for in between those stints. And he and I did a podcast together for about a year, and he mentioned this several times. He said people don't realize it's only when Israel is strong that America really started to embrace Israel. When they were weak, they ignored him, or it was a liability, as you just point out. Yeah.
What's troubling now is that in many ways Israel is as strong as ever, maybe stronger than ever. As you and I speak, the Assad regime has fallen. Israel has crushed Hezbollah, and the Iranian, the ring of fire, the proxy policy has been destroyed. But today's public opinion polls show a substantial minority of Americans turning against Israel, turning against aid to Israel on the left. The opinion polls of Trump voters and Harris voters show a real difference when it comes to Israel. In a way, it's not shocking because the left internationally has turned against Israel. I mean, it's true in Europe, it's true in Australia, it's true in Canada. Why shouldn't it be true here? But it's disturbing to see that, because how many years ago, let's say 20, Israel was a completely bipartisan issue for a while.
You mentioned, and just talking about the recent, I was curious what you thought. There was a vote, I can't remember, it was a few weeks ago, 19 senators out of 50, 19 Democratic senators out of 50 voted for suspending a number of weapons to Israel while it's still fighting. I know some people portrayed it, look, a majority of the Senate voted against it. I take it in the other side. 19 out of 50 Democratic senators voted during, for withholding the weapons. What's your thought on that?
Well, I think it's very disturbing. Some people say they don't like Bibi and it would get better if he were not there. I think there's some truth to that, but I think it would be marginal. That is, instead of 19, maybe it would be 17 or 16. You'd pick up maybe a few votes who just don't like him and might be persuaded by a different prime minister. But I think it's more fundamental of that. And you see it in the opinion polls. You see, and even more disturbing, it tends to be generational. People who are 20 or 25 are less likely to support the US-Israel relationship than people who are 45 or 65. So that's a trend that looks like it's growing, not diminishing. It's very worrying. And I think part of it is, on the Democratic side, I think part of it is there were a couple of Democratic presidents, Carter and Obama, who were not particularly pro-Israel, in my view, and who sort of created this sense that we and they are at odds. That is not Joe Biden, who's personally very supportive, yet his administration has been quite critical of Israel and has withheld at times some weaponry. So this is a pattern that, I think it's of great importance for American Jews who are supportive, and for anybody who is supportive of the relationship on our side or on the Israeli side. And by the way, the level of support among young evangelicals is also lower. That's another great worry.
By the way, my colleague Blaise Mishtal and I just had an op-ed a few weeks ago in the Wall Street Journal saying the list of withheld weapons is far more extensive than had been reported. Like everyone was saying just the 2,000-pound bombs, which is significant enough, but they're actually 1,000-pound bombs, 500,000-pound bombs, precision-guided munitions that are being withheld. And we listed that in our op-ed. One thing on that list, and I'm not an expert on all these senators, and I'm sure I have colleagues who follow, but it struck me, since October 7th, Hillary Clinton, for instance, well, Bill too, both the Clintons, I think, have been really, really strong, supportive of Israel. I think Hillary, it just sticks in my head when she was on The View once, not, I saw a clip of it, I don't watch The View, but, that she was really defending Israel strongly. You had Tim Kaine, who was her vice presidential candidate, when she ran in 2016 for president. He was one of those 19, by the way.
What's disturbing about that, I think you're right to point it out. We look at a few people, Van Hollen of Maryland, Murphy of Connecticut, Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, and we say, well, yeah, they are on the left wing of the party and they vote against Israel. But when you have someone like Kaine, who, as you say, was the vice presidential candidate and is generally thought of as quite moderate in the center of the party, when he's voting against some kind of military aid, as you said, in the middle of a war, it's really disturbing. It shows we have work to do. The Israelis also have work to do in reaching out. It'll be a job for their new ambassador.
Yeah, that's true. Let me go back and when you were talking also in your book on just a little back in time, because I find, as you just said a few minutes ago, we tend to project backwards. It's very common. We think what was before is just like today, and it's really not. Obviously, that's not the case, but it's hard to remember that or know it. I mean, you had a data point that I found that struck me when you say one indication of the closeness of the relationship between the United States and Israel were visits by Israeli prime ministers, official visits to Washington, or even private visits to the United States. And you noted how Ben Gurion, 14 years was prime minister, did not come to the White House once on official visit. Now that changes over the years with other prime ministers. Even Begin, who's obviously was not the most popular prime minister in Israel, in America,
Yeah.
all the time, but he visited almost on average once a year. But
Yeah,
I'm just curious if you could address this, because I hadn't realized that. I think it's it's an interesting index.
it is. Obviously you can come up with others, but you think about it, 14 years. He did see Kennedy, for example, once at the UN, but it's really striking. People seem to think that the idea that the Israeli prime minister should never visit the White House was fine. Why should he? And we're used to, Begin once a year, Sharon came several times, not only to the White House, but under George W. Bush to Bush's ranch in Texas. Rabin came. We're accustomed, Netanyahu, to there being a couple of visits a year, maybe more. But this is partly because he overlapped Ben Gurion, that is, with Eisenhower. And Eisenhower really had very limited ties both to Israel and to the American Jewish community. And again, we're going back in time now to a period in which the influence of the American Jewish community, the organization of the community, was not what it is today. Eisenhower, we all know about Truman had Eddie Jacobson, this friend from World War I, who actually got him to see Chaim Weizmann. Eisenhower had no Jewish friends like that. And there were basically no Jews in the White House. It really was a different period for the American Jewish community. Now we just take it for granted. Israeli prime ministers come here all the time, and American secretaries of state go there all the time.
Yeah. And by the way, as you imply, here you have FDR, which I know some about from my own research on Churchill. He did have Jewish friends, and he was, I found in my own research, rather equivocal about Zionism, and he certainly, and pretty indifferent to the fate of Jews in the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And he had Jewish friends, and then you're saying now Eisenhower, he didn't even have any. Yeah.
No, I get, we can debate what the meaning of friend is, but for example, Secretary of the Treasury under Roosevelt was Henry Morgenthau, who was a neighbor of his in the Hudson Valley in New York, and was essentially from his social class. And it mattered to have somebody like that, because when the United States finally did do something about the plight of European Jews with the War Refugee Board, how did that happen? Henry Morgenthau, that's how it happened.
Mm-hmm. Look, and I discuss a little bit in my book on Churchill and Zionism. We're not here to talk about that, but I saw instances where you had the Prime Minister of Israel, Winston Churchill, basically telling the President of the United States how they need to do certain things to save Jews from Europe. Not that the British did that much, but even setting up these camps in Northern Africa for Jews who made it through there during the war. I found that striking. But I bring this up also because one is, I think it's interesting and it's important perspective, but you also suggest in your book, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you wonder that, as we're kind of indicating what we just said about the 19 Democratic senators, that's possible that we're shifting back, that this 67 to period to maybe even what we're having even around now. By the way, you had Netanyahu speak a couple times with Trump right after the election. Ron Dermer met with Trump, at least once, very quickly. The speed, now the Israelis have an access that, I think most countries in the world would be very jealous of. But on the other hand, your book suggests, as a society, maybe we might be moving back to that it's possible we might head back to that pre-67 period, that's
Yeah.
not the norm.
Yep, it may be. There was a period when both parties were almost unanimous in their support of Israel, and where there was minimal tension in U.S.-Israel relations. And we may be moving away from that period. We've seen tension, I've said, under Carter, under Obama, a little bit now under Biden. And it may be that Israel is moving to being a partisan issue. It's also possible that the anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic movements and demonstrations that we're seeing are not going to go away. That having now emerged, they're going to be a permanent feature of college life, and that'll have an impact on the, kind of on American elites who go to those colleges. So it's possible that this kind of golden age that lasted several decades will prove to be ephemeral, and that for longer periods of time, Israel will be a very controversial issue, as we see in the opinion polls. And it's also possible that American Jews will now face more anti-Semitism on a regular basis. I don't think that's right. I hope it's not right. I think it's partly a leadership question. I think a lot of what goes on campus could be stopped if the boards of governors and the trustees, the presidents, the provosts put their foot down and enforce their rules, the rules that are already present, and made it clear what they think of this kind of anti-Semitism. That may or may not happen. And the same problem faces a lot of other Jewish communities in the diaspora too. And we see anti-Semitic incidents we just saw in the Netherlands, we just saw in Australia. So it's become a global issue.
Montreal, which is close to us, is becoming we've seen a number of incidents.
And one common factor here seems to be the failure of the police, in my opinion. Australian Jews have been complaining. In fact, when the Prime Minister just now went to a synagogue, he was heckled by some in the crowd. Jewish groups in Montreal have complained. Jews in London have complained. And it seems that police are holding back. This may be a police problem. It may, again, be a leadership problem. What are the instructions they're getting? Is there going to be zero tolerance for anti-Semitic activity or not?
Yeah. This might be for another discussion, but I've found that since October 7th and the surge of anti-Semitism, I frankly have been surprised a little bit that the American Jewish community leadership has not been even more vigorous on this issue. And that some of the leadership seems to be coming, as what you were indicating, from some leading businessmen and donors like Mark Rowan and having a mind block.
Cliff Asness is another one.
Asness,
Yeah,
they got Bill Ackman was very active, and they really stood up. It seemed to me, maybe they have different, but I personally thought with this historic anti-Semitism, we'd see even more vigorous pushback, at least publicly, from American Jewish leaders. But I don't know. I don't know how we compare to these other countries you just mentioned in terms of.
I've been surprised. For example, there have been some exposés of who is funding these pro-Hamas organizations and their anti-Semitic activities. And in some cases, it's foundations. And you don't see, or at least I haven't seen, the organized Jewish community, the American Jewish Committee and so on, actively going after the members of those boards to say, what are you doing? Using, there's no legal pressure, I guess, but using social pressure, individual by individual. What are you doing? How can you countenance the grants that this foundation is making?
Yeah. All right. Oh, I meant to mention John Jacobson's another. There are a number of
Yep.
some of these businessmen have been really leaders have been really good, but I wondered the same with you on the.
And I think a couple have said they were switching their grants
Yeah.
to Israeli universities in an effort to get more American Jewish students to
Oh,
attend those universities, which I think is a really terrific idea. And the other thing is, of course, to support alternatives in the US. At Tikva, for example, we're developing a program at the University of Florida. They have a new honors college, Hamilton College, that's being opened. And we want there to be, and they want there to be, a significant Jewish presence. So, you don't have to go to campuses where you are not wanted and you are going to have to fight for 4 years. You don't have to do that.
Dick was involved in that at Hamilton. I
Yes,
have a
very
friend.
much.
Oh,
Very much. And we announced actually on December 8th this new agreement with the University of Florida about Jewish studies and special scholarships for Jewish studies at their new honors college.
yeah, good. Well, congratulations. It's going to be interesting to watch. And we've seen statistics, I guess, how fewer Jews are applying to Harvard or some of these other, you know.
Yeah, we
Well,
talked about the golden age being over.
yeah.
I went to Harvard, and when I went there, it was about 1/3 Jewish. And many of the Ivy League schools were 1/3 Jewish.
Under college
more.
was? The
Yep.
college was 1/3.
Yes, and now I think it's about 12%.
Might even be less. I've seen
Less,
statistics.
same with Yale, Princeton, very low. Penn went way down, Cornell way down. Okay, we're 2% of the American population, so there's no reason we have to be half of the class in the Ivy League. But the decline is really quite striking. And the message, that we at Tikva were sending to Jewish parents and Jewish kids is there's a prestige meter. It's true. And you have to look at that. But there are other ways of measuring your college experience. Does the college want you? And will it protect you? And will it create a space where you can develop socially and intellectually? And will it have zero tolerance for this kind of anti-Semitic activity? And if it won't, go someplace else.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, we just have a couple minutes left, and personally, I find this conversation fascinating, and I recommend everybody buy your book, and it'll make some people happy, and it makes you actually kind of concerned, but hopefully it forces people to think and maybe do things differently going forward. What do you think at least on the bilateral relationship that's important? Obviously Trump's coming in. We talked about this the other day, maybe. The relationship between Israel and the United States might be pretty strong. I mean, coming in, it looking good, but on just taking the broader perspective, about your concern that we might revert back to this pre-67. What's important for the American Jewish community, obviously besides support organizations like JINSA, but things like that.
Well, that is important.
Yeah.
I think for Jews who are Democrats, get in the fight. I remember years ago, I used to go to what was called the Saban Forum every year. Chaim Saban had this big meeting, and it was basically 100 Democrats and me. One year it was me and John McCain, one year it was me and Lindsey Graham, and I would say to them, and this is literally 10 years ago, the polls show Democrats are moving away from Israel, and you should be concerned about that. And everybody would say, don't get political, don't get political. You're trying to, and I would say, no, I can't help you here. This is an internal issue to the Democratic Party. You've got to work on this. And they do have to work on it, including things like primaries, so that, the most extreme anti-Israel forces don't win primaries when they're beatable, when Jews could help come up with a moderate Democratic candidate who would win in the primary. And by the way, probably have a better chance of winning the general election too. So they should be in favor of it. I'm optimistic about the next 4 years for sure. Judging by the first Trump administration, I think we're going to have close relations. And I think the people that have been appointed so far, starting with Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, have long track records of support for Israel. This could be a fateful 4 years because you could see, first of all, a change of regime change of leadership in Iran with the Ayatollah, who's getting on in years and not in great health. You could see, God willing, a change of regime. You could see Iran, as a result of the failure of its proxy ring around Israel, decide that it needs a nuclear weapon faster. And that would confront Israel and President Trump soon, maybe 2025, with the question of the Iranian nuclear program and what to do about it, because we're getting to the end here. I mean, people used to ask me, why didn't George W. Bush solve this problem before he left office? And I think a large part of the answer is, wait a minute, that was 2008. He thought he had plenty of time before they got a nuclear weapon, and he was right. We're going to get into 2025 without them getting a nuclear weapon. That's 17 years later. So it's been a long time, but we know that they're there when it comes to enriching uranium. They have it. They're, as Tony Blinken said, weeks away. We do not know exactly how long it would take them to create a warhead, but certainly could happen in 2025. It absolutely is doable in this term of Donald Trump. So it's an Israeli decision, an American decision. I find it very hard to believe that if Israel took the decision to act, the Trump reaction would be, no, 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 don't do it. So we may be getting toward that day.
Yeah. As you point out, with the severe degradation of Hezbollah, what Israel did in Iran in late October, knocking out those S-300s, air defense. Now the fall of Assad, which isolates Hezbollah even more and might even allow more airspace for Israeli fighters.
It does. I mean, they've taken out the Syrian air defenses.
Yeah.
So
there's a fascinating opportunity, a window here, and coming up.
It is a window, and it's something obviously that Israelis have to think about. I think President Trump will be hearing from the Gulf Arabs that they're very, very, very nervous about this because they fear that Iran would take vengeance on them. Can't hit the United States or Israel very effectively, so maybe it hits them. But it's an issue that's not going to be postponed beyond this presidency.
I agree. And we'll see whether it might not be postponed beyond next year. We'll see how that goes. We're out of time. And then on that issue, I encourage everybody to keep following what JINSA's been putting out. Actually, Elliott is part of our Iran task force. We're putting out some soon on that administration, and we continue to put out things about how to also address this nuclear program of what the United States needs to do to help Israel, which is more likely to take the lead on addressing that nuclear challenge. I want to thank Elliott for joining us again. It's If You Will It, which is obviously from a line from Theodor Herzl. And Elliott, I thank you very much for writing this book, and I appreciate your speaking about it and addressing these serious issues that face the American Jewish community and the pro-Israel community. So
thank you, Mike.
No, thanks for joining us. Have a good weekend, everybody. Thank you. Thanks, Elliott.